Greetings to our viewers. My name is Mikaela Nhondo Erskog. I'm with you today on behalf of the No Cold War platform, a peace platform pushing for maximum global cooperation in a moment where the US government's aggressive policies and actions against nations like China threatens the interests of humanity as a whole. For more information, please check us out at nocoldwar.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at nocoldwar. Joining us today to discuss some of his work and political analysis on China's development, the decline of the US empire, and ongoing geopolitical struggles is Martin Jacques. Martin Jacques is a best-selling author with his book, When China Rules the World, having sold almost 500,000 copies worldwide. He's also an award-winning journalist, a visiting professor at Tsinghua University, Beijing, and Fudan University, Shanghai. As the world battles to contain COVID-19, within the various social and economic crises, Martin has continued to offer an incredibly important analysis on the changing balance of forces in global politics and economics. Thank you for joining us, Martin. To get us started, we wanted to ask you about this book that I happen to have a copy of. I think that makes us 1.5 million copies sold, which is called When China Rules the World, which you published over a decade ago. And we wanted to hear from you what led you to take on this mammoth task, and why did you write the book when you wrote it?
Well, actually, I don't come at all from a Chinese or even Asian background in terms of my interests. The first large part of my life was really the West. As an academic and as an editor. But I went to, in 1993, I went on holiday to, it doesn't sound very adventuresome now, but it was then, to southern China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. I also happened on that holiday to fall in love, and with someone who became Harry, who became my wife. She was from Malaysia, Indian Malaysia. And so I had this enormous passion, actually, for finding out about East Asia and finding out, and of course, my passion for Harry. And that's what led to a complete kind of U-turn in my life, really. I found at this point, the West boring, which I'd written about so much, and I couldn't get enough of trying to understand something I didn't understand at all. So I had no hinterland, no background in it. And as I studied it in various forms and managed to find ways of traveling and somehow getting paid for it and so on, I increasingly got interested in China because, it started with the Asian Tigers, but clearly more and more, it was clear that China was the central story. And, a friend said, why don't you write a book? Which I hadn't really I've been involved in various books, edited them, contributed to them, but I hadn't written a big solo. And so that's what happened. And it started, the working title originally was The End of the Western World. But it became increasingly clear that China needed to be in the title. And then at some point, partly my editor suggested it, although he thinks I suggested it, we came up with When China Rules the World. Anyway, there was my passion. Growing interest, growing knowledge on the one hand, and on the other hand was the rise of China as the great story of our time. And that's how it happened, basically. I started work on it in 1998. We went to Hong Kong because my wife got seconded there for her work. But after a year or so there, she died in very tragic circumstances as a result of racism, actually, in Hong Kong. And I lost, my son then was, our son was then 16 months. So I lost, a long time through everything and through grief. And I really resumed work in earnest in 1990. When was it? Sorry, not 1990, anything. In 2004. And I finished the book finally at the beginning of 2008. 2009. So there's a long story, a long version of what happened. So I stumbled, it's kind of accident really that this happened. If I'd never gone on holiday, perhaps I'd never have, well, it would never have happened.
But I must say, it must have been quite unusual at the time, given your background and your location in the UK, to write this kind of a book. What kind of challenges might you have faced during the process? I mean, of course, language is one of them, but perhaps from your Western positionality, maybe what are some of the challenges you faced writing the book?
Very important question. Well, obviously I didn't speak Chinese because I had, there was that would take a long time, and I'd only just come to it. That was a big problem for me. I was learning Chinese, but that really my Chinese wouldn't couldn't play any great role in that because it was starting from scratch. So that was one problem. I think that the big thing I wanted to do, I learned about difference really through Harry, my wife, and I knew Malaysia very well. She lived here in the UK for 4 years. I saw she had a completely different way of looking at Britain from my own, not surprisingly, from a very different place, a different race, different historical and geographical circumstances and so on. So I learned the importance of difference. I learned that if I was going over to China, and when I was in China, to try and understand China through Chinese eyes. I think that was that fundamental authenticity, that I wasn't going to try and project the West onto China, but I was a novice that was going to learn about China through Chinese eyes. And that's what I really tried to do. And I quite frankly, I think that's why the book, got it, broadly speaking, it was way ahead of its time for someone writing in English. And it got it right, I mean, it didn't get everything right, but all the big things it got right in an extraordinary way, if you look back in history. And I think that the reason for that was, exactly the point that you're making, which is that if you write a Westerner writes about China through Western eyes, it won't be a good book.
And that actually leads me to my next question, or the question we had. Much of the West simply don't understand China on its own terms, as you said, view China through their own specific lenses with the different historic prejudices that come from your geopolitical positioning. And we've seen, I would even say now, with the US and the rise of xenophobia and the kind of anti-Chinese campaign we've seen there, it's very dangerous. This kind of misunderstanding is very dangerous. Can you tell us a little bit about how China developed and what are the ways in which you came to understand it from, as you say, Chinese eyes or from a Chinese perspective? And can you tell us a little bit about how China's development differs from the path that was taken by the West?
Yeah, I mean, it's so fundamentally different historically and culturally that it is impossible to make sense of China using Western concepts and Western ideas. I mean, they have an applicability to Western history and Western ways of seeing things, but they don't help you at all to understand China. China is different. This is the most fundamental point. This is the starting point, the point of departure. The problem is that the Western outlook is enormously hubristic. It thinks, its basic starting point ever since the Enlightenment is that the rest of the world has to adopt and adapt to Western principles and Western ways of doing things. And, in that sense, never the twain shall meet, because quite frankly, Westerners sort of almost en masse are extraordinarily ignorant about China. I mean, they're not, until very recently, they were never taught about China. I mean, when I was at school, for example, which is a long time ago now, but, the only time China got a mention was when a master at school dinner time reprimanded me for not eating something I left on the plate. He said, "Think of the poor, starving Chinese." That's all I can remember anyone saying or mentioning the term China when I was growing up. Really, at home was a bit different because I came from a home which was quite political. So the difficulty is that China is not, in my view, a nation state. It's a civilization state. Its whole evolution has fundamentally different. Its governance system has always been profoundly different. There is a fundamental continuity in the governance system of China, in my view, from more or less from 221 BC and the Qin dynasty right the way through the imperial period to the present. So and we dismiss this as authoritarian, communist, and so on. Now, this just speaks to our own ignorance, not any understanding of China.
Thanks. And I mean, so now in the moment, thank you for recapping I think the very key things you shared with us in your book. What we would also like to understand in the present moment is now, after almost 80 years, I guess people would say, we've seen the kind of primacy of the United States. And we're slowly seeing, or people are predicting, a certain type of decline, whether it's in popular opinion or in economic terms. What can we kind of expect as China rises in the next year with Biden's administration from the US government? What do you foresee, based on what you've been thinking about in the last few years, what do you foresee as the kind of administration Biden will lead, as well as the implications it will have for how China relates to the US?
Well, I think that the change in the American position, which we saw with Trump, which is a major shift. It was the abandonment of the engagement and relative partnership, in some senses, between America and China that starts with the Nixon-Mao Accord in 1972. And broadly speaking, I think that defines, with ups and downs and so on, the relationship between 1972 and 2016. And the best place to read about this, I've just had to reread the book actually, is Henry Kissinger's on China. I mean, Kissinger's totally exceptional in the West, in that he does, as a Western sort of leader diplomat, in that he does really understand China in my view, in a quite a profound way. Now, America decided that, of course, the American assumptions about this relationship rested on the view that China could never overtake China, or United States never catch it up economically. And what's more, over time, the modernization of China would be the process of westernization, and it would become like a Western state. And of course, neither of those things have happened. On the contrary, the opposite has happened, as I argued it would in my book. And I think that with Biden, we're not going to see something more like the Obama period, or prior to the Obama period, handling of China. We're going to see something which is more in the Trump mold. But I think it will be less aggressive. I think it will be, I think there's the possibility of some kind of easing of the economic attacks on China, on technology, on trade, and so on. And the other major difference, though, which is that while Trump was very hostile, as you know, to alliances of any kind, alliances with America's old allies and anyone else for that matter, it was America first, America on its own, and so on. Biden is emphasizing alliances and so on. So we will see during this period, will be an attempt to draw a ring around China, if you like, and create a set of alliances in the region, which, in other words, in East Asia, which will in some form or another act to try and contain China, and at the same time also to try and draw in, Western countries like the UK and Australia and so on into that process. So now, I think that I think that this is obviously it's going to make things harder for China. Can it succeed? No, I don't think it can succeed. I mean, China's already gone as far as that kind of thing is concerned. I mean, China's up there, and it is going to be the most important economic and political power in the world, I think, without question. And we can see just with from the pandemic and so on, and China's growth since, just how formidable China's development is. So I don't think it's going to work. I think the big question in the longer run, the relationship between the US and China is that how long is this period of fundamental hostility towards China going to last? We shouldn't think it's going to last necessarily forever, because after all, the previous period of accommodation lasted a long time, actually, from 72 to 2016, but it did end. And so will this period, in my view. And the condition, in my view, the condition for it ending will be predicated on the willingness of the United States to recognize that it has to share primacy in the world with China. And in particular, of course, in China's backyard, namely East Asia.
That also takes us on to the next question that we had, which is, you spoke about and you mentioned building relationships. So the US building its relationships or regaining some of its relationships in the Biden era. What kind of implications does this have for the global South? Where does it lead Latin America and Africa and some of the other lesser or low-income economies in Asia in relation both to China and the US? What do you think?
Question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Crucial question.
With the apologies.
Let me just make one further point apropos of your previous question. And that is, there does seem to be a distinct gap, disparity opening up between Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other, as epitomized by the investment treaty, which was reached right at the end of last year between China and the EU. And so I think one of the problems that is apparent already and will become more apparent is the fragmentation, if you like, of the West, or even the balkanization of the West. I mean, at the heart of the West was really, the Cold War period and all that, was North America and Europe. And that is, it seems to me, that is beginning to break up. I'm not saying that Europe or parts of Europe won't go along with it, but if Germany, which is by far the most important country in Europe, has clearly under Merkel, and we'll see whether that carries on, but under Merkel has had a very different position on China over quite a long period, a very different view of the world actually to that of the United States, and that's become increasingly apparent. Now, on to your question, sorry. I think that China's view of the world is completely different from the West's view of the world. China's view of the world is a recognition that 85% of the world lives in the developing world, and only a small minority live in the West. If you're in the West, if you're in the UK, where we are now, or in the US and so on, they use the world really as more or less synonymous with the West. And so when they talk about the international community, they're always referring actually to themselves and their friends, not to the world as it is. China's view is completely different for this. And that's not surprising, because not only in terms of its own history, but also China, let's face it, was a developing country, still is in many senses a developing country. So China has an understanding of the problems of developing countries and a sympathy with the problems of developing countries, and an affinity with them which just the rich world does not have. And I think that you can see in the way in which China has started, probably most importantly, starting off, with Africa and its relationship with many African countries, in Belt and Road, which in a way, the relationship with Africa was to some extent a forerunner. And the Belt and Road is, overwhelmingly, with a few exceptions, particularly Europe and Japan, if they sign up for it, or South Korea, it is made up of developing countries. And altogether, of course, Belt and Road accounts for about 65% of the world's population. And likewise, China's developed, a very friendly relationship with Latin American countries and so on. So I think that China, you can't understand China's relationship and view of the world through a Western prism, because the West does not see the world like that, whereas China does. China sees the future in terms, I think, of an axis of the developing world. In other words, the rise of China opens the possibility, opens an era where, for the first time in modern history, the majority of the world's population become the subject of global institutions and global governance. I think that is the possibility that China opens. I'm not saying that everything China does is right. I'm not saying that China is also not, in some senses, behaving in a self-interested way. You'd expect that to be the case. But where China comes from and its outlook means that its relationship with the developing world and the possibilities for the developing world are that much greater.
Great. And with regards to that, given that there is this strong affinity between China having come from, and still is in many ways, a developing nation, as you say, what are some of the lessons perhaps that the developing world or the global south can learn from China based on the path of development it chose?
Well, I think that we've seen, I think what they can learn is how China's done it. Now, of course, at one level, that is, for most of them, would be preposterous, because China's this huge country with a huge population, which, apart from India and to a lesser extent a few other countries, is so much bigger than they are. But I mean, the China model of development, which is essentially pragmatic, believes in, by pragmatic, I mean you work it out as you go along. You don't use a preset model. It's based on experimentation. It's based on the central importance of the state. In other words, you cannot achieve any economic transformation without the state playing a very important role. But it is in the context of a very pragmatic view. You need to open up to the rest of the world. The old view that was very powerful after the Second World War, partly over Soviet influence and so on, of autarkic development, cut yourselves off, central planning, and so on. That the Chinese clearly don't follow that. The Chinese fundamentally believe in the importance of interconnectedness with the rest of the world, and so that's what and the developing world, of course, has come to embrace that overwhelmingly. That's what they do as well, not just in East Asia, but in Africa, in Latin America, and so on. So, so I think that in that sense, China is very different from anything we've had previously. Its approach is, well, the other point I should perhaps emphasize also is that the absolutely central proposition of China is development. That is the keystone proposition, development. Development is the key to the future. So it uses that as a test of what it's doing, its relationship with other countries, its policies, and so on. Development means the ability and possibility of these countries successfully transforming and modernizing themselves. That the West never talks like that. It just doesn't, you know, it's just purely a secondary question. They don't even think like that. You know? The big debate in Britain, for example, is over how much aid we should give. Now, frankly, that's not what how these countries have been transformed in their relationship with China, because China doesn't give aid in that sense. You know, it doesn't give handouts in that sense. On the contrary, what China gives is the possibility of these countries being transformed by trade with China in particular.
Awesome, thank you. That leads us then to our last question, which, when I was reading your book, and actually the subtitle is kind of what inspired me to ask this question, is you subtitle it, or subheading is "The End of the Western World and the Birth of a New Global Order," right? And we've seen a lot of pessimistic readings from analysts like Richard Haas, who've described China's rise and its kind of pivotal role in the new global order as a return to the dark ages. We wanted to hear from you. Does China seek to supplant the US? Is a multipolar future possible where no single power is hegemonic? What would that look like? And what would that look like?
Well, first of all, just on the subtitle of my book, it was slightly different from the original hardback, and I think this is better actually than the original one.
Rise of the Middle Kingdom.
Yeah. I mean, what I was trying to say is, of course, it's not the end of the Western world in the sense that the West is over. I mean, we can have a discussion about that, about what's going to happen to the West, what's happening to the United States, and so on. But the end of a world dominated and shaped by the West is what's coming to an end, where the West is hegemonic, where it is the decisive arbiter of what happens in the world. That's what's come to an end. And in my view, what that does involve is a profound shift in the nature of the international system, hence the birth of a new global order. Because, and I've already suggested that actually the birth, what will be the hallmark of this new global order? Actually, instead of the world being organized and dominated by a very small minority of humanity, it opens up the possibility of actually the majority of people in the world being at the heart of the global order and global institutions and the global future. So that's a very, I mean, I think the change is as profound as that. Of course, it doesn't happen overnight, it happens over decades, but we can already see actually the speed with which so many things have changed already. I mean, I wrote the book, I can't remember now, what it was published in 2009. So 12 years ago, you know, and when my book came out, a lot of people said, well, yeah, very interesting, you know, but you know, surely it's not going to be quite like that, or maybe you called it wrong. Well, actually, so I was would have been on the, you know, in my view, the sort of super optimistic scale of the spectrum. But actually, you know, even my book underestimated, I think, the speed of the change in certain respects. I mean, the speed of China's rise, the speed with which China's moved from a relatively passive to a proactive position, and the speed of the decline of the West. That is that has been remarkable. And the political crisis, for example, which now in a way underlies and will, I think, dominate for a whole period the situation in the United States. Now, I think I haven't answered your question yet. So could you remind me what it is?
Does China seek to supplant the US? And
thank you, yes.
Or is a multipolar future possible where there's no single hegemonic power?
Yeah, thanks. I don't think that China wants to supplant the United States, because I don't think China really thinks like that. I mean, I think that, I mean, what you'll see is China becoming stronger and stronger. It will seek to reform institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and so on. which it has tried to do already, and with other developing countries. It will establish new institutions like Belt and Road and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I think what will happen to the renminbi? Well, I'm sure the renminbi will become the world's leading currency at some point. So inevitably, the rise of China will, in some discretion, let's say, not supplant, but displace the position of the United States. I think that's probably the way we should see it. I mean, in the book I'm working on now, I think that, which is about China as a great power and what it will be like, I think you can see from Chinese history that its relationship with the world has always been profoundly different, actually, from the Western view of the world. I mean, China never had an expansionist view of itself. It never colonized. It did have an international order in its region, which lasted thousands of years, which is called the tributary system. But it didn't involve occupation. It didn't involve political interference. It didn't involve, military conquest. I mean, China was, apart from its war with Vietnam, it barely fought any wars other than those it had with the sort of tribes on the to its north. So, whereas the West believed in, colonization, bases around the world, I don't think China's going to do that. I don't think I don't think for China, military power is very important. I mean, it needs to be able to deal with the problem of the American threat on its southern border, the South China Sea and so on. And it needs to be able to protect its trade routes, because China is by far the biggest trading country in the world now. But that's not belligerent. That's just defending your peaceful trade. So I think that the way China will rise will be very different. Also, there's another crucial difference, and that is that China, and I've already hinted at it in the context of the past, but China has never seen itself as a model for other countries. I mean, it wants to help other countries. It wants to help developing countries, but it doesn't say, well, you've got to be like us. You've got to have, a one-party system and a communist party and our ways of doing things. In fact, China has always renounced this position. I mean, not just now, but historically, it's never lived like that. Why? Because China thinks it's very exceptional and that no other country can be like that. So it acts, in some senses, it acts the model, but in other ways, it doesn't. So this is a view, of a world which will become, in my view, increasingly cynicized, but in ways that are quite different from the ways in which the world became westernized.
Well, thank you for that. We also got a little sneak preview into your new book.
Yeah, you can come around and help me finish it if you like.
Well, that sounds really exciting, and we look forward to it. Hopefully it won't take a decade, but we'll be excited nonetheless when it comes out. Thank you, Martin, for those. I don't know if you have any last comments you want to share with us, generally about the current situation between the US and China.
Well, I think that I think that the situation, if you're living in the West as we do, do you normally live in the West?
Currently, I'm in South Africa, but I was recently in Sweden, which is my father's homeland.
Okay. Well, you've got a nice international axis there. I think that in the West, the situation over the last few years since Trump, attitudes towards China have definitely regressed and become at times, particularly during the early months of the pandemic, ugly. And I think that's and that's affected not just the right, but quite frankly, if you look at the Labour Party in the UK on China, is useless, really. Doesn't understand anything. Just joins in the same chorus. paper like The Guardian, very, very disappointing, and so on. So I think that, what does that tell me or tell us? I think it tells us that the level of understanding of China is pitifully low. You know, I mean, it shows you in some ways how reactionary parts of the left are. I know that's a very strong word to use on this question. Because what's happened is they view China overwhelmingly in human rights terms. Their version of human rights. Not, so for example, the fact that China's taken 800 million people out of poverty, the majority of its population, is not regarded as a human right. In fact, in my view, that is the starting point of human rights. You know, I mean, so what they do is they project their values and their institutions that they like in the West onto China, measure China against them, find China in certain respects fails the test, and denounce China. So what kind of worldview is that? I'm thinking particularly here of the sort of sections of the left and liberal left and so on. But not everyone's like that. I don't want to paint the picture, but there's definitely been a regression over the recent period. And so, you know, the atmosphere has become tougher, in my view. I mean, you know, there was a period more or less coinciding, you know, with when I started working on China from around the turn of the century until 2012, 2013, 14, 15, when there was a sort of, you know, I don't want to exaggerate this, so I've got to choose my words carefully, but, you know, more open-minded attitude, more curiosity about China. And then, bang, the closing of the doors. Let's go back to our fundamentalist principles. Let's go back to bigotry. Let's face it, also, let's go back to xenophobia and racism. And that has so much colored attitudes in the West over the recent past towards China. But, you know, the other side of the coin to this is China's rise. You know, China's not going to go away. China's going to get stronger and stronger. So we're going to have to, ultimately, we've got to come, the West and people in the West have got to come to terms with China. And you can't come to terms with China if you just dismiss it. You won't get anywhere that way. So they're fighting a totally losing battle. But it, you know, for the time being, it's, yeah, we've got to do the fighting as well.
And that's precisely why we're so glad you could join us, so that we can continue to try to galvanize forces in the world who want to know about China, who want to understand China on its own terms, and to better inform the kinds of extremely disappointing decisions that are being made and led by the US government and its various allies across the world. On that note, I'd like to thank everyone who could join us. For those of you who stand for peace and global cooperation, from the No Cold War platform, we invite you to sign our statement, a declaration in support of a world in which China and the US base their relations on mutual dialogue and the common issues which unite humanity. For more, you can visit our website, nocoldwar.org, or you can follow us on Twitter at nocoldwar. Thank you and have a good night.